In the breath before stone learned to speak, something was already building. Not with hands or tools or the weight of intention as we know it, but with patience measured in tides and the slow arithmetic of cells dividing in dark water. Long before the first primate stood upright and wondered at the sky, long before consciousness folded back on itself to ask what consciousness was, the earth was already under construction. Towers rose from ocean floors in silence. Chambers branched through soil without architects to name them. And in the dim morning of the planet, when light was still learning how to fall, the first builders were shaping a world they would never see completed. What if we have always been the apprentices, arriving late to a workshop already humming with ancient work? Dawn touches the edges of deep time. Somewhere in the gap between what happened and what we imagine happened, the question opens like a door with no frame. Before cities, before cairns, before the first deliberate stacking of one stone upon another, there were other hands, or what served as hands in eras when hands had not yet evolved. There were other intentions, or what passed for intention when intention had no words to guide it. The planet was never empty. It was never waiting for us to begin. It had already begun, over and over, in forms too small, or too slow, or too strange for our brief attention to hold. Everything was already underway. The question is not whether other builders came first. The evidence lies beneath every footstep, encoded in limestone and locked inside the spiral architecture of ancient reefs. The question is what we mean by building, and what building means when stripped of blueprints, language, and the human habit of naming what we make. If an organism reshapes its world to survive, is that construction or simply living? If living itself is a form of construction, then the first builders emerged with the first life, and the earth has been a building site for as long as anything has breathed or photosynthesized or split itself in two to continue. The dawn brightens, the workshop hums, and we arrive, blinking, to find the foundations already ancient and the walls already tall. Most geologists place the earliest evidence of life's construction roughly 3.5 billion years ago, in shallow waters that have long since vanished. The builders were not organisms as we picture them. No eyes, no limbs, no nervous system threading signals through tissue. They were bacterial communities called cyanobacteria, and what they built were structures known as stromatolites, layered mounds of sediment and mineral cemented together by the slow accumulation of microbial mats. Each layer represented generations. Each ridge was the fossilized memory of countless cells living, secreting, and binding the ocean floor into something solid. These were not accidents. Evidence suggests that stromatolites formed through biological activity, not mere sedimentation. The bacteria colonized surfaces, trapped grains of sediment, and produced sticky compounds that held everything in place. As they grew upward toward the light, they created domes and columns and branching forms that rose from the seabed like underwater cathedrals. Some stromatolites grew for thousands of years. Some still grow today in a few rare places where the conditions remain as they were in the planet's youth, in shallow bays off the coast of Western Australia, in hypersaline lagoons where few other organisms can survive to disrupt their ancient work. They are among the oldest architecture on Earth. Scientists believe these microbial builders did more than construct their own homes. They transformed the atmosphere itself. Through photosynthesis, cyanobacteria released oxygen into an ocean and air that had held almost none. Over hundreds of millions of years, this oxygen accumulated. It rusted iron in the water, creating vast bands of red mineral deposits that still stripe the geological record. It saturated the seas. Eventually, it filled the sky. The Great Oxygenation Event, as researchers call it, fundamentally reshaped the planet's chemistry and made complex life possible. The builders of stromatolites were also, in a sense, the builders of breathable air. They built the world that would later build us. The process was neither quick nor gentle. Evidence suggests that the rise of oxygen triggered one of Earth's first mass extinctions, as organisms adapted to an oxygen-free world could not survive the new atmospheric chemistry. The builders were building not just structures, but entirely new conditions for existence. Their construction project lasted longer than any human civilization will likely endure. Roughly 2 billion years passed between the first stromatolites and the great oxygenation event's completion. 2 billion years of patient accumulation of cells dividing and dying and dividing again, each generation adding its microscopic contribution to a transformation that would make forests and animals and eventually human breath possible. Time drifts forward through uncountable mornings. By roughly 540 million years ago, the ocean teemed with new forms. Among them were creatures that secreted calcium carbonate to form external skeletons, shells, tubes, protective casings. Coral polyps emerged, tiny animals no larger than a fingernail that gathered in colonies and built reefs from their own bodies, layer upon layer, generation upon generation. These reefs became vast structures, some spanning hundreds of miles, sheltering ecosystems within their limestone labyrinths. The light at noon holds steady over green water. The coral did not plan the reef. Each polyp performed its small labor, feeding, growing, secreting, and the architecture emerged from the collective. There was no overseer, no blueprint encoded in any single mind. Yet the result was monumental. Undersea cities of calcium that altered ocean currents, protected coastlines, and provided habitat for thousands of species. Reefs shaped the flow of water and the distribution of nutrients. They changed the planet's geography in ways no single organism could. Researchers have studied how reef structures redirect wave energy, dissipating the force of storms before they reach shore. A healthy reef can reduce wave impact by up to 97%, protecting coastal ecosystems and preventing erosion. The reef is infrastructure built without engineers, maintained without budgets, functioning according to principles discovered through millions of years of trial and error, encoded in coral genetics. Meanwhile, on land, other builders were at work. Roughly 400 million years ago, plants began to colonize the continents, their roots breaking rock into soil, their bodies forming the first forests. This was construction on a planetary scale, the literal creation of the medium in which terrestrial life would flourish. Before plants, there was no soil as we know it, only bare rock and mineral sediment. The plant's roots secreted acids that dissolved stone, creating the first thin layers of earth. When the plants died, their bodies decomposed, adding organic matter to the mineral base. Slowly, over millions of years, the land became habitable. Beneath those forests, fungi threaded through the ground, weaving vast networks of mycelium that connected tree to tree, transporting nutrients and chemical signals across distances that could span acres. Some researchers propose that these fungal networks functioned as a kind of communication system, allowing plants to share resources and warnings. A tree under attack by insects could send chemical signals through the fungal network, and neighboring trees would respond by producing defensive compounds before the insects arrived. The forest, it seemed, was not a collection of individuals, but a collaborative structure built by countless organisms shaping the earth together. And among the forest roots, insects were tunneling. Evidence shows that termites have been building for at least 150 million years, possibly longer. Their mounds, constructed from soil and saliva and fecal matter, can rise over 20 feet tall and house millions of individuals. Inside, the architecture is astonishing. Ventilation shafts regulate temperature and humidity. Fungal gardens provide food. Nurseries shelter the young. The termites do not work from blueprints. Each individual follows simple rules. Carry this grain, deposit saliva here, and from those rules, complexity arises. The mound emerges not from a single vision, but from the collective algorithm of millions of tiny builders responding to local conditions. The structure knows more than any termite does. Researchers have studied these mounds and found that they maintain nearly constant internal climates despite wild external temperature swings. The ventilation system functions through passive airflow driven by differences in heat and pressure. Air enters through pores near the base, warms as it rises through the colony's heat-generating core, and exits through chimneys at the top, creating continuous circulation without any mechanical pumps or fans. Human architects now study termite mounds to design energy-efficient buildings. The insects, in other words, solved problems of sustainable construction long before humans existed to ask the questions. The same could be said of beavers, who reshape entire watersheds with their dams. A beaver dam floods forests, creating wetlands that store carbon, filter water, and provide habitat for species that would otherwise never survive in that landscape. The beaver does not intend to engineer the ecosystem. It simply cuts trees and builds barriers to create deep water where it can safely store food and escape predators. The ecological transformation is a side effect, but it is also profound. A single beaver family can alter square miles of terrain, and researchers propose that beaver-engineered wetlands once covered vast portions of North America before human trappers reduced beaver populations by as much as 90% in the 18th and 19th centuries. The dams themselves are marvels of adaptive engineering. Beavers adjust their designs based on water flow, adding height where current is strong, creating spillways to prevent overflow, repairing breaches within hours of their formation. They work at night, by touch and sound, building structures that can last for decades and grow to hundreds of feet in length. The longest beaver dam ever recorded stretches over half a mile through a remote Canadian forest, visible from space, built and maintained by generations of beavers who never met but continued the same essential work. The question begins to blur: where does instinct end and intention begin? Where does building stop being biology and start being culture? Perhaps the distinction was never real. Beyond the record's edge, where data becomes interpretation and interpretation becomes dream, there is space to wonder what these ancient builders knew. Not knowledge in the human sense, not language or mathematics or self-reflection, but something quieter, a kind of knowing embedded in action. The bacterium did not understand oxygen, but it made oxygen anyway. The termite did not study thermodynamics, but it built a structure that obeyed thermodynamic principles with precision no single insect could comprehend. Perhaps the Earth itself has always been smarter than any single organism living upon it. Some studies propose that complex systems, ecosystems, colonies, neural networks, exhibit emergent intelligence that exists at the level of the collective, not the individual. A termite mound thinks, in a sense, even though no termite within it thinks about the mound as a whole. A forest knows where nutrients are needed, even though no tree possesses a map. Intelligence, by this framing, is not locked inside skulls. It is distributed through relationships, through the connections between parts. A flock of birds moves as one organism, each individual responding to its nearest neighbors, and from those simple interactions emerges the fluid geometry of murmuration. No bird leads, no bird knows the pattern, yet the pattern exists and persists and adapts to threats with a responsiveness that looks remarkably like thought. If this is true, then the first builders were also the first thinkers, not in our image, but in their own distributed way. Dusk begins to gather. The stromatolite grows in darkness, layer by layer, recording time in stone. Each band is a year or a decade or a century, depending on the growth rate and the availability of light. The structure remembers what the bacterium forgets. The mound endures what the termite cannot witness. Architecture in this light becomes a form of memory, a way for small, short-lived organisms to inscribe something larger than themselves into the fabric of the world. We do the same, though we rarely name it so plainly. Our cities are collective memory solidified. Our roads are desire paths made permanent. Every building is a decision about where to shelter, how to organize space, what to value, that outlasts the individual who made it. We think of ourselves as exceptional builders because we plan consciously and name what we make. But planning and naming are simply the latest tools in a very old practice. The first builders taught the earth to hold memory in stone, in mound, in reef. We inherited that lesson, refined it, accelerated it, but we did not invent it. It may be more honest to imagine that building is not a human innovation, but a planetary habit we happen to join. Consider the coral polyp again. It inherits no knowledge of reef architecture. It is born, it feeds, it secretes calcium carbonate, and it dies, often in less than a year. Yet the reef continues. Each generation adds to the structure, blind to the larger pattern, faithful only to its small task. Over millennia, the reef becomes a monument to collaboration across generations that never meet. The Great Barrier Reef, stretching over 1,300 miles along Australia's coast, began forming roughly 20 million years ago. 20 million years of polyps living and dying, each one building without seeing the vastness of what it contributed to. Is this so different from a cathedral built over centuries, where the stonemason who laid the foundation never saw the spire completed? Is it so different from the body of scientific knowledge, where each researcher adds a fragment without grasping the entirety? We like to imagine that consciousness grants us clarity, that because we can name what we're building, we understand it. But perhaps consciousness is just another tool for construction, like the beaver's teeth or the termite's saliva. Useful, powerful, but not fundamentally different in kind. We build with intention, yes, but the consequences of our building spread beyond our intentions in ways we cannot predict or control, just as the cyanobacteria's oxygen had consequences no bacterium could foresee. Somewhere in the silence between neurons firing and cities rising, the question shifts again. If we are not the first builders, and if building is not unique to consciousness, then what are we building now? And for whom? The termite does not benefit from every chamber in the mound. Many rooms exist only for ventilation, only for structure, only to serve the integrity of the whole. The bacterium in the stromatolite does not benefit from the oxygen it produces. Indeed, oxygen was initially toxic to many early microbes. They built a world that would sustain future life, not their own. Perhaps this is the deeper pattern. Builders rarely see the full consequences of what they construct. They build for the now, for the immediate need, and the future inherits whatever emerges from that accumulated effort. The fungal network connects trees not because fungi care about forest health, but because the fungi benefit from trading nutrients for sugars. The benefit to the forest is real, but incidental. The mycelium is building a trading network. The forest is what happens when millions of such networks interweave. We build cities, and the cities build us in return, shaping how we think and move and relate. We build technologies, and the technologies reshape our cognition and our culture in ways we cannot predict. We build carbon into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere builds new weather, new coastlines, new climates that will determine which species, including perhaps our own, can continue building. The tradition continues, the workshop hums, and in the dim light of this moment, standing in a world that was already ancient when our species arrived, we are just the latest builders in a line that stretches back to the first bacterial mat clinging to a sunlit stone. We are not the authors of construction. We are not the inventors of shaping the world to suit our needs. We are apprentices in a much older guild, learning by doing, often unaware of the larger structure we contribute to. The coral builds the reef, but does not see the reef. The termite builds the mound, but does not comprehend the mound. And perhaps we, too, are building something we cannot yet name, some planetary structure that will only become visible from a distance we will never achieve. Perhaps our cities, seen from a sufficient remove, look like termite mounds or stromatolites, the inevitable result of a particular kind of organism responding to its environment according to its nature. Perhaps consciousness is not the thing that makes us different from other builders, but simply the thing that makes us believe we are different. The question is not whether we are special. The question is whether we are humble enough to recognize the tradition we belong to. Time softens at the edges. The light thins to amber, then to ash. And in the quiet between epochs, where data fades into feeling, there is room to consider what it means to be a builder in a world already built. When stone forgets its shape, does it still remember heat? When the reef crumbles back into sand, does the ocean hold some trace of the structure that once stood? When the mound collapses and the termites scatter, is the architecture lost, or does it linger as a template in the behavior of the survivors? Memory is not only written in neurons, it is written in sediment, in chemical gradients, in the shapes that life carves into matter. The stromatolite is a library, each layer a page inscribed by organisms that died before the page was turned. The forest is a ledger, its mycorrhizal networks recording which trees gave and which received, which partnerships succeeded and which failed. The coral reef is a monument, and every species that shelters there is reading a message written by polyps that lived and died centuries before. We walk through a world saturated with messages from the past. Some we can read: the fossil record, the tree rings, the layers of ice preserving ancient air. Others we can only intuit: the way certain animals still build as their ancestors built, the way certain plants still colonize terrain using strategies developed when the continents were joined. The past is not gone. It is beneath our feet, inside our cells, shaping every breath and every step. And we are writing our own messages now, whether we intend to or not. Every structure we raise will become a layer in some future sediment. Every change we make to atmosphere and ocean and forest will echo forward into times we cannot see. We are building, as all living things build, and what we build will become the foundation, or the rubble, for whoever builds next. The question is not whether we will leave a mark. All builders leave marks. The question is what kind of foundation we are laying. Oceans rise, continents drift. Time keeps breathing. The beaver gnaws the tree, and the tree falls, and the stream becomes a pond, and the pond fills with sediment. And eventually the pond becomes a meadow, and the meadow becomes a forest again, and another beaver finds another stream. The cycle is not a circle, but a spiral, each turn slightly different from the last, each generation building on the ruins and residues of those who came before. Nothing is ever truly finished. Nothing is ever truly begun. There is only continuation, only the ongoing work of life shaping the world that shapes it in return. The termite mound, abandoned, melts back into the earth it was made from. The nutrients disperse. The soil shifts. And somewhere nearby, a new colony begins its work, gathering particles, binding them with spit, raising walls toward the sky. The architecture is not the same, but it is continuous with what came before. The knowledge is not transmitted through teaching, but through the patient persistence of form. Perhaps this is what tradition means at the deepest level. Not the preservation of the past, but the continuation of patterns that work, tested against time, refined by survival. Not rigid replication, but faithful variation. We inherit not just genes, but gestures, not just knowledge, but the inclination to build, to shape, to gather scattered things into structures that hold. We stack stones because something in us responds to the logic of stacking, the same logic that guided the stromatolite upward toward light, the same logic that guides the termite to carry one more grain. The satisfaction of building runs deeper than culture. It is older than language. It might be older than consciousness itself. The simple rightness of making order from chaos, structure from scatter, shelter from exposure. The impulse is older than our species. The habit is deeper than culture. To build is to participate in a conversation that began billions of years ago and will continue long after the last human hand rests. And when we look at what we've built, our monuments and our mistakes, our beauty and our waste, perhaps the kindest lens is the one that sees us not as conquerors or destroyers, but as participants in an ancient practice, still learning, still trying, still adding our small layers to a structure whose full shape we cannot see. The question was never whether we are the first builders. We are not. The question was never whether we are the best builders. That judgment is not ours to make. The question, perhaps, is whether we can learn from the builders who came before us, learn their patience, their responsiveness, their willingness to build not for themselves alone, but for the systems they belong to. The stromatolite did not hoard resources. It built in a way that oxygenated the ocean and made future life possible. The coral does not build in isolation. It builds in relationship, creating habitat for thousands of species in a structure stronger than any individual polyp could produce. The termite does not build for glory. It builds because building is what sustains the colony, and the colony is what sustains the termite. The beaver does not build for legacy. It builds because the water must be deep enough and still enough to survive the winter. There is humility in this. And maybe something like wisdom, not the wisdom of knowing, but the wisdom of doing what needs to be done, what has always needed to be done, what will always need to be done as long as life continues. The light fades now to the color of old iron. The sky, if we could still see it, would be deepening toward indigo, and the first stars would be arriving like slow breaths. In the workshop of deep time, the tools are still warm. The work continues without us, as it continued before us. The bacteria are still building their mounds in shallow bays where the water is warm and the sunlight reaches the bottom. The termites are still raising their towers in savannas and forests across every continent but Antarctica. The coral, where it has not been bleached or broken, is still secreting its slow walls into the dark water. The beavers are still felling trees, still packing mud, still building the deep, still pools they need to survive. The earth is still under construction. It always has been. And we are here, briefly, holding our small portion of the work. Not the first builders, not the last, somewhere in the middle of a process that began before intention had a name and will continue after intention is forgotten. What we build will be judged not by its ambition, but by whether it allows the building to continue, whether it enriches the soil for the next generation of architects, the next wave of builders who may not resemble us at all, whether it holds space for complexity, for diversity, for the emergent intelligence that arises when many small parts work together without knowing the whole. The question opens again, quieter now. What if the first builders on Earth weren't human? They weren't. They are not. They will not be. Building is the work of the living, and the living have always been more than us. The darkness is not empty. It holds the hum of construction too small to hear, too slow to witness, too distributed to locate. Somewhere a bacterium is dividing. Somewhere a polyp is secreting calcium. Somewhere a termite is carrying a grain of sand toward a wall that will outlast its life by decades. Somewhere a fungal thread is reaching toward a root, beginning a partnership that will feed a forest. The work continues. The earth keeps building. So do we.